When a security guard kicked out a limping veteran with a Purple Heart, he never saw what was coming. 3 generals. 1 letter. Frank Dobson's humiliation at Mason Heights Medical Center was caught on security cameras as he limped into the rain. This was about to trigger a reckoning that would shake the entire healthcare system. The generals didn't just bring authority. They brought proof. And what that letter revealed will make you question everything about how people treat those who served our country. Before we start, comment where you are watching from. The fluorescent lights of Mason Heights Medical Center buzzed overhead, casting a sallow glow across the polished lobby floor. Frank Dobson limped toward the reception desk, his worn military cap clutched in weathered hands. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his hip, shrapnel from Kandahar that never quite healed right. Rain had soaked through his jacket during the 3-block walk from the bus stop, and droplets fell from his silver hair onto the pristine tile. "Sir, you need to wait behind the line." The security guard's voice cut through the quiet hum of the hospital. He was young, too young to recognize the insignia on Frank's cap, with a crisp uniform and an earpiece that gave him an air of self-importance. Frank glanced down at the red line taped to the floor, then back up at the guard. "I'm here for my appointment with Dr. Mercer. It's about my hip." He gestured toward his leg. "Been waiting 6 months for this consultation." The guard's eyes flicked to his computer screen. "Name? Franklin Dobson. Sergeant First Class. Retired." Fingers clacked against keys. The guard frowned. "You're not in the system for today." Frank fumbled in his pocket for the appointment card, the paper now soft and damp from the rain. "It says right here, May 4th, 10 a.m. The guard barely glanced at it. "That's yesterday's date, sir." "No, that's not possible. I've had this marked on my calendar for months. Our system shows your appointment was yesterday. You missed it." Frank's chest tightened. "There must be some mistake. I need to see Dr. Mercer today. The VA arranged this specially." "Sir, if you missed your appointment, you'll need to reschedule through the proper channels." The guard's voice had taken on that particular tone reserved for difficult elderly people. "You can't just show up and expect to be seen." "I didn't miss anything," Frank insisted, his voice rising slightly as a woman with a stroller gave him a wide berth. "Check again, please." The security guard stood straighter, hand drifting toward his radio. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. There are sick people here." "I'm one of them," Frank said, his voice quiet but firm. "I served this country for 27 years. I just need 5 minutes with the doctor." "Rules are rules, sir. I can call someone from scheduling to help you make a new appointment." Frank leaned heavily on his cane. "The next available slot is in August." "I've already checked." "Then I guess you'll be seen in August." The guard's tone was final. Frank felt eyes on him from the waiting area. Mothers with children, elderly couples, nurses passing through. The shame of being treated like a nuisance burned worse than the pain in his hip. He'd commanded men in combat, planned operations that saved lives, and here he was, being dismissed by a boy who couldn't be more than 25. "My records, then," Frank tried. "Could you at least print my medical records so I can take them to the VA clinic?" The guard's patience was visibly thinning. "Records requests go through medical records, first floor east wing, and they require 48 hours notice." Frank's hand trembled slightly on his cane. "Son, I drove an hour to get here, and the bus only runs to this part of town twice a day." "That's not the hospital's problem, sir." The guard stepped from behind his desk. "I'm going to have to ask you to exit the reception area now." Around them, the quiet buzz of hospital activity continued. The squeak of rubber soles on tile, the distant chime of an elevator, the soft conversations of families waiting for news. But for Frank, the world had narrowed to this moment, this humiliation. 27 years, Frank repeated, softer now, almost to himself. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photo. Himself in uniform, standing before a helicopter, much younger, but with the same steady eyes. 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star, and I can't even get 5 minutes. The guard glanced at the photo, unmoved. "Sir, if you don't leave voluntarily, I'll need to escort you out." Frank searched the young man's face for any sign of empathy and found none. With a deep breath, he tucked the photo away and straightened his back as much as his injury would allow, the instinctive posture of a soldier receiving orders, even unjust ones. "What's your name, son?" Frank asked quietly. "Wilson. Marcus Wilson." Frank nodded slowly. "Well, Mr. Wilson, I want you to remember something. Someday, if you're lucky, you'll grow old too. And I hope when that day comes, someone shows you more kindness than you've shown me." The guard's expression flickered, the first crack in his professional veneer, but he quickly recovered. "Exits that way, sir." With deliberate movements, Frank placed his cap back on his head and turned toward the sliding glass doors. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the pavement. Each step toward those doors felt heavier than the last. Behind him, Frank heard Wilson radio something about situation resolved, and a bubble of something, not quite anger, something colder and more resolute, rose in his chest. As he passed through the doors into the rain, Frank pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and pressed a number he hadn't called in years. "Colonel, it's Frank Dobson." He paused, rain soaking into his shoulders. "Yes, it's been a while. Listen, I need to ask you about something. It's not just about me anymore. It's about every veteran who's been treated like they're invisible." The apartment Frank called home was a modest one-bedroom on the eastern edge of town, walls adorned with faded photographs and bookshelves lined with military histories. He sat at his kitchen table, a small lamp casting warm light over scattered papers, medical forms, VA correspondence, and newspaper clippings about budget cuts to veteran services. The clock on the microwave read 8:47 p.m. as Frank methodically organized his records. His fingers, once steady enough to field strip a rifle blindfolded, now occasionally trembled as he sorted through the documentation of his medical journey, a bureaucratic trail of referrals, denials, and rescheduled appointments spanning 3 years. The phone beside him lit up. "Frank? It's Hayes. I made some calls. Thanks for getting back to me, Colonel." "Drop the Colonel, Frank. I've been retired longer than you have." There was a pause. "What happened today? It's not isolated, is it?" Frank rubbed his eyes. "No. Been trying to get this hip looked at properly for years. VA sends me to specialists who refer me back to the VA. Around and around it goes. You got your records?" "Everything. Doctor's notes say I need surgery, but approval keeps getting caught in red tape. Today was supposed to be my consultation with the surgeon." Hayes's voice deepened with concern. "Your service record. Frank, you were part of Operation Silent Shield." Frank's eyes drifted to a small wooden box on his bookshelf, the only place he kept mementos from that particular deployment. "That was classified." "Not anymore. Not all of it, anyway." Hayes paused. "The radiation exposure reports were released last year. Most of the men from your unit have filed claims." Frank's hand stilled over his papers. "What radiation exposure?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "They never notified you?" "Notified me of what?" "Exactly." "Frank, the joint pain, the difficulty walking, those aren't just from the shrapnel. Your unit was exposed to ionizing radiation during that operation. The government acknowledged it in a settlement last year." The room seemed to tilt slightly as decades of medical mysteries suddenly found explanation. Frank reached for the table to steady himself. "Why wasn't I included?" "Your records show you were notified and declined to participate in the class action." "That's impossible." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "I never received any notification." Hayes sighed heavily. "Administrative error, or was something more deliberate. Either way, you were left out. The settlement provided specialized medical care and compensation." Frank's gaze drifted to a photograph on his wall. Himself and his unit, arms around each other's shoulders, young faces squinting in desert sunlight. 3 of those men had died of unusual cancers before turning 60. "I need to make some more calls," Hayes said finally. "Do you still have your original deployment papers?" Frank's eyes moved to the wooden box. "Everything. Good. Hold tight. And Frank, what happened to you today at that hospital? It's happening to veterans all over. The system isn't just broken. In some cases, it's deliberately obstructive." After ending the call, Frank crossed to his bookshelf and retrieved the wooden box. He hadn't opened it in years. Some memories were better left contained. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing a collection of items. medals nestled in velvet, folded papers, a laminated photograph of his original squad, and a sealed envelope marked with the words "in event of disclosure." His commanding officer had given each of them this envelope before the operation, with explicit instructions to keep it sealed unless officially notified of declassification. For 25 years, Frank had honored that instruction. His fingers hovered over the seal. Hayes's words echoed in his mind. The radiation exposure reports were released last year. If what Hayes said was true, then the time for disclosure had come and gone, without Frank ever being informed. With a deep breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. As he read, the color drained from his face. This wasn't just about denied medical care or missed appointments. It was about systemic failure to notify veterans of known health risks, risks the government had documented and then buried in bureaucracy. The doorbell rang, startling Frank from his reading. He carefully returned the papers to the envelope before making his slow way to the door. Sarah Chun stood in the hallway, her nurse's scrubs exchanged for jeans and a sweater, concern etched on her face. "Mr. Dobson, I'm from Mason Heights Medical Center. I was on shift when you were asked to leave this morning." Frank studied her, wary but curious. "How did you find my address?" "I looked up your file after my shift." She glanced down, then back up, resolute. "What happened today wasn't right. I've seen it too often, veterans getting caught in administrative cracks." Frank hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. "You could lose your job for this." Sarah placed her bag on the coffee table and pulled out a folder. "Maybe, but I took an oath to care for patients, not protect hospital administrators." She opened the folder, revealing printouts of medical records. "You weren't mistaken about your appointment. It was moved without your notification and then marked as a no-show when you didn't appear yesterday." "Why would they do that?" "That's what I came to tell you." Sarah lowered her voice. Mason Heights has been systematically rescheduling veterans with complex cases, particularly those likely to require expensive treatments. They move the appointments without proper notification, document them as no-shows, and use that to justify refusing specialized care. Frank's jaw tightened. "How long has this been happening?" "At least 2 years, since Westbrook Healthcare took over management." She pulled out more papers. "I've been documenting cases. You're the 47th veteran this has happened to since January." As Sarah explained the details of what she discovered, Frank felt the same cold resolve that had crystallized in him at the hospital entrance. This wasn't just about his hip anymore. It wasn't even just about veterans. It was about a healthcare system that had learned to exploit those least able to fight back. "What are you planning to do?" Sarah asked finally, noting the determined set of his jaw. Frank glanced at the wooden box, the scattered medical records, and the phone where Hayes's numbers still glowed on the screen. "I'm going to need your help," he said quietly. "And I'm going to need those records." The morning air hung heavy with anticipation as Frank stood on the sidewalk outside Mason Heights Medical Center. The same sliding glass doors that had closed behind him in shame 24 hours earlier now reflected the early sunlight and the approaching figures behind him. 3 generals in full military dress uniform approached the hospital entrance with deliberate steps. Brigadier General Ramsey, Major General Collins, and Lieutenant General Hayes. Their combined service medals caught the light like small constellations. Hayes carried a sealed envelope bearing official military and Department of Justice insignias. Behind them, a news van from the local station had just pulled into the parking lot, a reporter already speaking into a handheld microphone. "The letter's been authenticated at the highest levels, Frank," Hayes said quietly, patting the envelope. "Are you sure about this?" Frank adjusted his own uniform, pressed and complete for the first time in years, medals aligned with precision across his chest. The effort of standing straight sent pain through his hip, but today he welcomed it. "Never been more certain of anything in my life." Inside, the hospital lobby hushed as they entered. Patients and staff turned to stare at the unusual sight, 4 decorated military officers moving in formation across the polished floor. At the security desk, Marcus Wilson straightened abruptly, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio before freezing in midair. Frank approached the desk, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the tile. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson. I believe you remember me from yesterday." Wilson's eyes darted between Frank and the three generals behind him, his gaze fixing momentarily on the official envelope in General Hayes's gloved hands. "Sir, I'm not here to make trouble," Frank interrupted calmly. "These three generals have come with an important letter for Hospital Director Caldwell. I believe he's expecting us." Indeed, through the glass walls of the upper administrative level, Frank could see figures moving with sudden urgency. Blinds being opened, ties straightened, a flurry of activity that suggested the arrival of three generals bearing an official letter had achieved its intended effect. The elevator chimed, and Director Caldwell emerged, his tailored suit and practiced smile at odds with the beads of sweat forming at his temples. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could speak in my office?" "I think right here will do fine," General Collins replied, his voice carrying across the now silent lobby. "Unless you're concerned about who might hear us?" The director's smile faltered. "This is highly irregular. Patient matters are confidential, which is exactly why we're here." Frank stepped back as General Hayes stepped forward, presenting the sealed envelope he'd been carrying. "This is a formal letter of investigation from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the State Medical Ethics Board, authorized by the Secretary of Defense himself." The color drained from Caldwell's face as Frank continued, his voice clear enough to reach every corner of the lobby. "For 2 years, Mason Heights Medical Center has systematically discriminated against veterans seeking care, particularly those with service-connected conditions requiring expensive treatment. Appointments have been deliberately rescheduled without notice, resulting in documented no-shows used to deny care." A murmur rose from the gathered onlookers, patients, nurses, administrative staff. Frank noticed Sarah Chun standing by the nurse's station, her expression grim but resolute. "These are serious allegations," Caldwell managed, his voice losing its authoritative edge. "They're not allegations. They're documented facts." General Hayes ceremoniously broke the seal on the letter and unfolded the contents, revealing dozens of affidavits attached to the formal notice. General Ramsey and General Collins moved to flank Caldwell on either side, their presence imposing and unmistakable. 47 cases since January alone. Veterans denied care through administrative manipulation, many suffering permanent health consequences as a result. The lobby had grown so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed thunderous. Frank stepped closer to Caldwell, close enough to see the man's pulse jumping in his throat. "Yesterday, you thought I was just another old man you could dismiss. Today, I'm the face of a federal investigation that will examine every decision you've made since taking over this hospital." Lightning flashed outside the windows, followed by a low roll of thunder that seemed to underscore Frank's words. The storm that had soaked him yesterday had returned, but this time Frank stood on the inside, dry and empowered. Caldwell's professional veneer cracked completely. "We operate within federal guidelines for appointment management. Any rescheduling would have been properly communicated." "Like this was," General Ramsey interrupted, pulling a document from the letter package and holding it up. "This internal memo explicitly instructs staff to reschedule veterans with complex cases to the end of each month, knowing the backlog would push them to the following month, then the next. It specifically targets VA-sponsored appointments." A gasp came from somewhere in the crowd. Frank noticed several staff members exchanging glances, some surprised, others notably not. Marcus Wilson stood frozen behind his security desk, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as he began to understand his role in the system they were describing. "The most damning evidence," Frank continued, pulling out the papers from his wooden box, "comes from my own case. I was part of a military operation where we were exposed to radiation. The government has acknowledged this exposure and established a settlement program for affected veterans." He turned toward the gathering crowd, making sure his voice carried to every corner. "Mason Heights received notification of my eligibility for this program 2 years ago. Instead of informing me, those records were buried. My appointments for related symptoms were systematically rescheduled until I would give up or die waiting. The words hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. In the silence that followed, the whir of a camera from the news crew by the door seemed explosively loud. Director Caldwell's face had gone from pale to ashen. I wasn't personally aware. Your signature is on the policy document, Hayes interjected coldly. Frank held up his hand, silencing both men. For a moment, the lobby was completely still, the eye of a hurricane of truth that had been building for years. I didn't come here for your excuses, Frank said finally, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. I came here because somewhere in this hospital are veterans just like me, unaware they're being systematically denied care they've earned. And somewhere in this hospital are good people who don't realize they're part of that system. He turned towards Sarah Chun, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. Some already know and have been gathering evidence at great personal risk. Then to Marcus Wilson, who looked as though the floor beneath him had suddenly dissolved. Others have been following orders without understanding the larger pattern. Frank turned back to Caldwell, who now seemed to be mentally calculating the cost of lawyers and settlements. Starting today, every veteran who has been denied care under your administration will be contacted. Every case will be reviewed, and every person responsible for this policy will be held accountable. The thunder outside had moved closer, rain now drumming against the glass doors. But inside, something had shifted. Hospital staff were moving closer, many nodding in grim understanding. Patients who had been silent observers now stood in solidarity. This stops today, Frank said, his voice ringing with the authority of a lifetime of command. Not just here, but in every hospital where profit has replaced compassion. As if nature itself endorsed his declaration, lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the lobby in a flash of brilliant light that caught the medals on each military uniform, casting momentary halos around men who had served their country and now served justice. 3 months later, Frank eased himself onto a park bench, the summer sun warm on his face. His new hip, surgically replaced 6 weeks ago, still ached occasionally, but the constant grinding pain that had been his companion for years was finally gone. Across the path, children played on swings while their parents watched from nearby benches. One father limped slightly as he pushed his daughter higher. Another veteran, Frank guessed, recognizing the particular gait of someone adjusting to prosthetics. "Is this seat taken?" The voice belonged to Marcus Wilson, no longer in a security uniform but dressed in casual clothes, a textbook tucked under his arm. Frank gestured to the empty space. "It's a free country. Some of us work to keep it that way." Wilson sat, his posture reflecting a new humility. "I've been meaning to thank you. After what happened, after what I did, well, it changed everything for me. In the months since the confrontation at Mason Heights, much had indeed changed. The hospital's board had removed Director Caldwell within days. Federal investigators had uncovered similar patterns at 12 other facilities owned by the same healthcare group. Class action lawsuits have been filed on behalf of hundreds of veterans. "I hear you're in school now," Frank observed. Wilson nodded. "Nursing program. After seeing what Nurse Chen risked to do the right thing, I wanted to be that kind of healthcare provider." He hesitated. "I keep thinking about what you said that first day, about growing old and hoping for kindness." Frank watched a monarch butterfly drift across their path. "We all get old if we're lucky. Not all of us learn wisdom along the way." Behind them, the sounds of construction carried from Mason Heights Medical Center, visible through the trees. The hospital was undergoing renovations, including a new Veterans Care wing being built with funds from the settlement. "They're naming it after you," I heard, Wilson said. "The Dobson Veterans Center." Frank shook his head. "Not after me. After all of us who served. I was just the one who wouldn't go away quietly." A young woman approached, her press badge identifying her as a reporter from the national news. "Sergeant Dobson, do you have time for a few questions? Your story has inspired similar investigations in hospitals across 5 states now." Frank gestured to the bench. "I've got nothing but time these days." As Frank spoke with the reporter, others gathered, first a few curious onlookers, then more veterans who recognized him from the news coverage, then medical student from the nearby university. His story had become a rallying point, a case study in patient advocacy classes, a cautionary tale for hospital administrators. The father from the playground approached, confirming Frank's suspicion about his military service. "You don't know me, sir, but because of what you did, I got a call from the VA. Turns out I qualified for a treatment program I never knew existed. My daughter," his voice caught, "she gets to grow up with a dad who can walk with her." Frank nodded, understanding the depth of what remained unsaid. Around them, the crowd had grown, many sharing similar stories of calls received, appointments suddenly available, doctors apologizing for systemic failures. As the afternoon light softened into evening, Frank found himself surrounded by the very community he had fought for. Not just veterans, but healthcare workers committed to reform, journalists documenting systemic problems, ordinary citizens awakening to injustices hidden in plain sight. Sarah Chun arrived after a shift, still in scrubs, now working at a different hospital where she headed a new patient advocacy department. "The policy changes from the general's letter are going through," she told Frank quietly. "Mandatory notification protocols, transparent scheduling systems, independent audits, everything they demanded that day." Frank nodded, his eyes drifting to the same sky that had rained on him that fateful day. It was clear now, painted with the oranges and purples of sunset. As the gathering gradually dispersed, Frank remained on the bench, watching the hospital in the distance. The security guard who had once ejected him now sat beside him as a student of healthcare. The nurse who had risked her career now led a department. The veterans who had suffered in isolation now found community and shared experience. Wilson broke the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something, sir? That first day, when I was escorting you out, you asked for my name. You made a point of it. Why?" Frank smiled slightly. "In the military, we learned that accountability starts with identity. I wanted you to know that you weren't just a uniform that day. You were a person making a choice." Wilson considered this. "You could have just complained about me, filed a grievance. What good would that have done?" The problem wasn't one security guard following orders. It was the orders themselves and who was giving them and why. From his pocket, Frank withdrew the worn photograph he had shown Wilson that day, himself as a young soldier. Beside it, he placed a newer image, himself surrounded by veterans outside the hospital the day the investigation was announced. 27 years I served," Frank said, echoing his words from their first encounter. "But what happened after I took off the uniform might matter even more." As dusk settled over the park and lights began to illuminate the paths, Frank leveraged himself up with his cane. Not from necessity now, but from habit. The pain that had defined his movements for so long had eased, but the determination that had driven him to seek justice remained. Wilson stood as well. "Same time next week for the Veterans Advisory Meeting?" Frank nodded. "I'll be here. Some battles don't end just because you've won the first skirmish." As they parted ways, the young man toward his future in healthcare, the older man toward a home no longer filled with just memories, but with purpose, Frank thought about that day when 3 generals had arrived with a letter that changed everything. The official notification he should have received years ago might have spared him pain, but its absence had sparked a movement that would spare thousands more. And when it mattered most, 3 generals with enough stars between them to form a constellation had stood by his side, a sealed letter in hand, ready to fight for justice in a different kind of battlefield. The setting sun caught the windows of Mason Heights, transforming them from institutional glass to sheets of gold. Frank paused to look back at the building that had once rejected him and would soon bear a name honoring service. The security guard who had once forced him into the rain now walked a path toward healing others. The system that had failed so many now faced a reckoning long overdue. Justice, Frank reflected, sometimes arrived with generals and formal notices. But more often, it began with a single voice that refused to be silenced and rippled outward until the world could not help but change. Have you been moved by this story of justice and transformation? Share it with others who appreciate narratives about standing up for what's right, even when facing powerful opposition. For more compelling stories that explore themes of justice, dignity, and systemic change. Follow our page and join the conversation about how individual courage can create lasting impact.